Molweni, ndiyanibulisa nonke apho nikhoyo. Ndibulisa nabakwiqonga lonxibelelwano lwethu. Goeiedag and welcome allemaal. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome both in-person and virtual delegates to this closing session of the 16th Stellenbosch University Library Symposium. A special welcome to Dr. Morné Mostert, Mostert students who are here today, joining us all the way from France, virtually. This is probably another first in the history of the Stellenbosch University Symposium. Ladies and gentlemen, you too are welcome, that is from France. My name is Sivue Bangani, and I'm the director responsible for research services at the Stellenbosch University Library and Information Services. As indicated in the program, this session has two items. We'll have Dr. Mostert now joining us in person to provide the closing address. Thereafter, Ms. Ellen Tice, the Senior Director of Stellenbosch University Library and Information Service, will make her closing remarks and vote of thanks, of course. So where I come from, you do not speak after a senior member of the family has closed the meeting. So out of respect for this tradition, you'll not hear from me again thereafter. Ms. Tice will rightly have the final word. Colleagues, it is a great honor to introduce a truly renowned and well sought after speaker, Dr. Mostert. We appreciate that a speaker of Dr. Mostert's caliber has agreed to provide a closing keynote address at this symposium. Dr. Mostert is the director of the Institute for Futures Research at the Stellenbosch University. At Stellenbosch, we already think about the future. We don't just focus on the current. We reflect and use the current to actually think about the future. And he's a full member of the Club of Rome. He's a senior strategy specialist and advises globally on foresight for executive decision-making. Some people prefer to pronounce executive as executive. He has worked in Europe and Africa. Dr. Mostert holds a PhD in management of technology and innovation. His areas of specialization include futures thinking, strategic thinking, systems thinking, and creative innovation. He was the founding chairman of media tech startup Africa Business Radio and is a member of the ILO International Panel of Experts on the Future of Work. There is still quite a long biography here that I actually stole from his LinkedIn page, because he didn't send it, but I'll stop there. So yeah, of course, unfortunately, unless colleagues, there's still a bit of time, there is no engagement in this session. So if, of course, there's a bit of time, then I will allow that. But in terms of the program, there's no engagement that will happen in this session. Dr. Mostert, over to you.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Thank you for that lovely introduction. My mother would have been proud, I think. And thank you for that round of applause, which for a futurist is weird before you start speaking. It's a kind of anticipatory round of applause in the hope that this may end up being something. What it will be, I'm not entirely sure. Just over lunch, one of the guests who has left since she found out I would be speaking, mentioned to me that you're the last speaker at the conference, which is an impossible job, because either you will be repeating what everyone else has said, in which case you can claim foresight, or you will say what no one else has said, in which case you can claim creativity. So I shall leave the decision up to you. Thank you so much. A real honor for me to be with you. As you heard in the introduction, I work largely in creative thinking, systems thinking, futures thinking, systems thinking, the world of thinking, which I find is a great deal easier than actually doing anything. So this afternoon, I'll talk to you a little bit about one futures question that one might ask about the future of libraries, and that is, will libraries of the future be inverted knowledge scavengers. Let me make my case for you. Firstly, let me express my deep gratitude to the Library Services of Stellenbosch University for housing over the last 10 years my own book. And I'm sure that sentiment is shared by all three people who borrowed it over the last decade. There was a time where we did something called going to the library. A great learning adventure, as no student ever thought of it. We are, of course, in a very different time, and I've no doubt that you've covered all the possibilities of what that might mean for us today. In the world of thinking that I'm engaged in and work that I've done all over the world, as you've heard, I'm often challenged by clients. I spend most of my time working with senior leaders in large organizations, and often there's a call for new thinking. And the way that I've conceived of it is that you can have new thinking by changing the content of your thinking, you can change the method of your thinking, or you can change the level of your thinking. So content is really about what are you thinking about, 5 most frightening words to a man. You can change the method of your thinking, so rather than just being analytical, you can be creative, systemic, futuristic, and you can change the level of your thinking. So rather than be sort of operational, you can be a lot more strategic and futuristic. And I work in this world for very good reason, inspired as I am largely by Dr. Seuss and the terrible grammar that goes with that. So my key question for the future of libraries to you this afternoon, colleagues, is will the knowledge and the thinking find me when I need it most? Or will I have to somehow keep going to it now that it has materialized and is much more difficult to find? We live, of course, in a world where you can make this case. That innovation is sometimes new, but not always new. And in some way, the future is already with us and always has been. As many have said, the future in a sense is already here. It's just not, as we say, evenly distributed. The difficulty with making decisions for the future is that you're always making that decision in the present, and the present is a very noisy place. Politicians and media and all manner of distractions. So the question is, what are you making that decision on? Well, very often the answer is, well, we make it based on the past. What else can there possibly be? So that's already interesting. You can only ever make a decision in the present with all the noise of the day. Even if you make it tomorrow, it'll be the present then. And you typically base it on the past. But here's the important question for a futurist. What are you making it for? Well, of course, there's only one option there, and that is you can only ever make it for the future. So there starts our curiosity with how time messes with the mind and the quality of decision-making for senior people, making it in the noisy present, often basing it on a time that you will never see again, and making it for a time that you've never seen before. And that wreaks utter havoc. It's perhaps for that reason that Winston Churchill said that the empires of the mind will be, or already are, the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. Of course, that is your good world, the empires of the mind. But Rogers argues that the process that we use to get to the future could also turn out to be the future that we get. And that the reason we can often not see the future is that the method we use to see the future is already the problem. And that has an awful lot to do with mindset, which is a great word for me. Mindset can mean, I think, one of two key things. Either that your mind has set, like a jelly, or worse, like cement, or like that panna cotta I never had for lunch. But also, it may mean that that as that mind has set, of course, it makes a reading of the past, the present, and the future even more difficult. It might also mean that you're confronted with this deep conundrum that all of us as futurists have, which is if we say something new, then people say, well, that's a bit foreign. We don't do that here. But if it's not new, then they say, well, that's outdated. And then if it is foreign, they say, well, that's not local at all. But if it is local, they say, that's not very international of you, is it? So what we often are asked to do is clients say to us that we want something completely new, which confirms exactly what we're already doing, which recognizes our complete uniqueness and is benchmarked, of course, against all the others who are doing exactly what we're doing. So in innovating for the future, which by the way is the only possible time you can innovate for, you have this deep conundrum. We often get this brief. We want everything to change, but nothing must be different. Something that Homer perhaps would have posed to us. We say as futurists that the way you spend your intellectual time is to spend about 20% of your intellectual energy as a senior person on the past. Very sensitive debate. We're enamored with the past. It gives us a false sense of security. And we think therein lies also much of the wisdom. That is a dilemma for an industry, the library industry, which can only possibly have a source which has already been written, coming as it inevitably must from a time called the past. About 30% of our intellectual energy, we argue, on what's going on right now, in other words, paying attention, as I trust my students from France are doing right now, although to be honest I have my reservations, and about 50% of your intellectual energy on what hasn't happened yet. What hasn't happened yet? Predominantly two things: what could happen, and then very importantly from a strategy perspective, what should happen. And as we move into the future, of course, it's very difficult for us to shake some of those vestiges of the past. Here's a recent experiment. We're scientists here. It's important that we experiment. One of the experiments I did myself, which I really loved, have you ever tried this experiment? Have you ever tried to yellow page Google? I don't mean Google the yellow pages. I mean yellow page Google. I did this experiment and the findings are clear. Yellow pages suggests we don't know what you're talking about. It did not match any searches. Simply couldn't find what you're referring to. And that's because Google is not the yellow pages online, which I think has implications for the way that search happens in the future. There's a new paradigm of search, you can hear, is my thesis here. And so part of the dilemma of embracing the future is to consider, of course, as futurists always discuss, our mental models. And I've chosen as an example of that Naomi Campbell. Shows my age a little bit, but the only reason I did that is Naomi Campbell is very famously a model and also a bit mental. Mental models, we should be reminded, of course, are not the world. They're representations of the world. And in those representations, it's noteworthy that this is an attempt at making sense. Of course, that the lenses we use for understanding, if left unchallenged, as we all know, become the world itself, in the same way as I've argued before that the lenses we use to interrogate the future become the future that we interrogate. So mental models, of course, we all have them, and they're inescapable, I think, shape inescapably the way that we're reading risk and opportunity, which can only ever be for the future. And in that process of trying to make sense, one of the dilemmas, I think, for readers of the works you all curate is whether those readers are simply taking sense from those texts or making sense of those texts, and the extent to which it is your role to help them with sense-making in addition to simply sense-taking. Of course, our mental models are an approximation of reality, if such a thing could even exist as reality, but as the natural consequence of our attempt to think, we are inevitably confronted with bias that deviates from, if the theory of reality is anything to go by, from some kind of sense of what's actually going on. Bias is a kind of oblique sense-making, a kind of slanted interpretation. That's particularly relevant, of course, in the era of the echo chamber in which so many find ourselves, where as soon as I search, I discover immediately what I already think. I mean, we had this theory, didn't we, that the reason for stupidity, that universities are referred to as ignorance or temporary ignorance. We had the theory that the reason was a lack of access to information. Of course, the advent of the internet has disproven that theory completely, that in fact ignorance flourishes despite the abundant availability of scientific information. And the difficulty is that, of course, that echo chamber becomes a trap. And I've no doubt that in your industry you will save us from this dilemma. I'm looking for literary selfies, says the millennial. Well, autobiographies, you know where to find them. Einstein challenges our industry like this by saying, your imagination is your preview of life's coming attractions. That poses, I think, a real challenge to the notion of collecting works, curating works, and making those available. He goes on to be even more bold and argue that the true sign of intelligence is in fact not knowledge, but imagination. Let's face it, I suppose some people can benefit from reading a book first, and then perhaps to use their imagination. But is there a role for imagination in the curation of established knowledge in the future of the library world? It strikes me that is unavoidable. In addition to which, of course, we shall be looking to your good industry to save us from the theory of alternative facts. In a world of post-truth, in a world of so-called experts, in a deliberate attempt to undermine the very possibility of scientific evidence, to subject, in fact, established science to the continuous and almost overwhelming need for a social debate, as if an opinion has the same merit as established science. The opening of the mind is an enormous challenge. I like to think of it as the cremora challenge. Allow me to explain for those visiting us from outside of South Africa. In the 1980s, there was a very famous advert. It was a time when electricity was unreliable. Some things don't change. A large company called Nestlé thought it'd be fantastic to have baby powder for adults. And this was an enormous success. There's a very famous advert of a gentleman standing at the fridge. He's looking for the milk. This is in the days of consumer education advertising. We're going to teach the populace that you don't put the thing in the fridge. So he's looking in the fridge. It's only half a cubic meter. He can't find it. He's obviously not the sharpest pin in the packet. And he gets frustrated, often the sign of a low intellect, early frustration. And then he asks the advice of the consultant in the bedroom. You can hear from her tone, she is realizing that she has not married well. And it ends in a terrible divorce. They don't show the whole movie, they only show this one sliver in which the consultant advises it is in fact not inside. It is on top and all around. This seems to be contradictory to the wisdom of Oprah Winfrey, who seems to argue always that it is inside, if you can only look inside yourself. So our recommendation now, very much if you want to study the future, is that the answer is, unless you're in an alien movie, is not inside. It's not going to come from the inside. It's much more likely to come from the outside. But I know that you're taking careful notice of what's happening outside the borders of your own industry. So in reading that text, of course, as all good readers of text will know, text is useless without the context, some notion of the subtext, and even an understanding of the pretext. And one has to wonder in one's imagination in the future of libraries of whether that service is also on offer in the next few years. Knowing as we do, as even Donatello Versace said, that creativity comes from the conflict of ideas, which I have no doubt library services will help us navigate as we traverse the treacherous world of cancel culture. So the dilemma, I think, is that we're moving to very interesting cognitive networks, of course global as indeed this symposium is, but that those cognitive networks are now connected across all manner of boundaries and borders and classifications. And again, I look forward to how libraries will save us here. We need undoubtedly many eyes from different vantage points on the same problem. And in that regard, I think libraries are amazingly well positioned to help us with those multiple partial views. The difference is staggering between thinking of looking beyond oneself and seeing the oncoming traffic. We know, of course, that there's been enormous advances when it comes to thinking and the study of the brain. I am personally more interested, as you can hear, in the functioning of the mind, which it turns out is not exactly the same as the brain. I mentioned one interpretation of mindset earlier, this notion that the mind can set, but another version of interpretation there is the idea that mindset is in fact a set of ideas that dominate the mind, that they work in packs, ideas hunt in packs, in all kinds of bias and discrimination and categorization and segmentation and segregation. They hunt in packs. They seem to sit together. And the mind is a master at making connections, sometimes false connections, when what we're really hoping for is not the repetition of the same ideas, but compatibility, indeed complementarity of ideas, not necessarily a copy of ideas. Here on our very own astonishing continent with 55 countries, over 2,000 languages, 2,000 tribes, over 66% of the world's remaining arable land, over 80% of the world's platinum, for example, a large number of other resources, that epistemological tradition is rich and worth celebrating. So as much as we go into the future, of course, occasionally, as I said, we do spend 20% of our intellectual energy on the past, and here is just one exciting example to be reminded of, which every African librarian, I'm sure, knows very well. In the time of Ptolemy, the Museum at Alexandria, this amazing research institute, you had the sort of academic superstars of the day, Archimedes, Euclid, Aristophanes, and a number of others. A very rich original African epistemology. It doesn't end there, of course. We have this astonishing collection of scrolls in the modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, Axum. Axum was really, in its day, around 270 AD, was the kind of Manhattan of Africa, a place of immense diversity, global trade, and religious and ethnic diversity. Obvious signs also, of course, of the written word from that time. Another one I really quite like, if we move ahead just 150 years or so, is Augustine of Hippo, Bishop of Hippo Regius, who wrote about things that you can see on Sky News and CNN every day today. Rational beings wondering about whether free will is possible and whether such a thing exists as a just war. Just consider what's happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in South Sudan, and so on. I have to say, I do find that photograph rather interesting. It seems at that time that was the equivalent of the millennial selfie ducklup. That if one posed there for a photograph, you know, rather than pierce one's lips, one would pretend to be inspired by a higher power and possess wisdom beyond the earthly realm. Of course, the kingdom of Mapungubwe is another fantastic example of a rich intellectual tradition, building very unusually already in the 13th century an astonishing, vibrant city of global change. Mapungubwe was really, in the 13th century, the international gold exchange of the world. It goes beyond that, as I'm sure many of you know, with the first university on earth, not in fact Bologna with respect to our colleagues from Italy, but in fact Ezzatone in Tunis. I was there about 3 years ago. This was already established in 737, modernized more recently. You might think, well, what a fluke. Not so. Even the second oldest university is from Africa, Al-Qarawin, in Morocco in 859. And as if that is not enough, all still before Bologna, Al-Azhar University in Cairo in 970. Maybe you think that's all in the very far north. Well, of course, we're intimately, all of us, familiar with the University of Timbuktu in the 12th century. It would be a few centuries before we had the next university in Africa, the University of Sierra Leone. And then, suddenly, the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference, where European powers, some of them attending this webinar today online, had a look at the map of Africa and decided to chop it up like it was their own little pizza. And that, of course, had an enormous ripple effect for many decades on the flow of information, the searchability of ancient wisdom, and the social fluid library, if you want, of the African continent. But Pliny was not wrong when he said in around 79 AD that there's always something new from Africa, and to that I look forward initially. Of course, considering learning and knowledge of the future is a dangerous game. Here's an example. I particularly chose an example from France, as some of my students from France are attending today. This is the attempt of Jean-Marc Coetet in 1899, who tried to imagine what learning might look like in the year 2000. Turns out that you know, there's always someone doing the actual work, and then there's the benefit of utter laziness in the background. There's a professor with glasses just pumping whatever's left in the library down some kind of chute, which is then transferred in a very sort of Elon Musk kind of way into the base of the brain. Turns out Coetet and Musk don't disagree with each other too much. There is, I think, though, a massive opportunity for us here in the African continent to connect some of the centers of excellence, astonishing examples of brilliance in South Africa, but indeed beyond in the overall African continent. We must move, I think, beyond the sort of trilateral business, government, labor environment. I think academia, and particularly library services, have an enormous opportunity here to both share and promote the power of science. It was one of those astonishing benefits, wasn't it, of, if it's not too early to talk about the benefits of COVID. We had a similar conversation during lunch. That, in fact, we had on African television the appearance of a real scientist. This was astonishing. No ideological debate, or very little, you know, very little ideology, fist fight, and much more a scientific orientation and an international orientation. That, I think, is part of the power of knowledge, which, of course, your good industry will help us to promote. And of course, we need citizen participation. By connecting some of these amazing centers of excellence, I think we have an astonishing opportunity. When you look, for example, at professional management in corporate South Africa, it's in the top 26 in the world, according to the Global Talent Competitiveness Index, and especially management research institutions are in the same classification. And so by making those connections, you can hear that as a theme of my talk, I think we have some amazing opportunities. Beyond that, we have explicitly, in the South African Constitution, explicitly, academic freedom and the freedom of scientific research. Obviously, with a firm foundation of ethics, but an astonishing liberty. Something I always ask audiences all around the world, put up your hand if your Constitution makes explicit the right of scientists to study with ethics, that nothing should be safe from scrutiny, and that if done ethically and scientifically, those findings can be communicated. That, of course, is partially, at least, your job, protected as you are by our amazing Constitution, respected all over the world. One of our challenges, therefore, that you will almost inevitably help society with is to take this overwhelming mass of information and help us to transfer that into some kind of structured, organized knowledge, knowing as we do that transdisciplinarianism is a rapidly rising curiosity. And then help us, ladies and gentlemen, to arrive ultimately at wisdom, a kind of automatic understanding of where the key risks and key opportunities are. I shall leave you perhaps with the words of the Hollywood comedian George Burns, who famously said, "I look to the future because that's where I'm going to spend rather a large part of the rest of my life. You've been very kind. Thanks very much. Thank you.